Hello, and welcome back to the Alexander Society. This is a podcast where we prove that we do indeed have friends. Also, there's some history and alcohol involved somewhere in there, whatever. I'm your host, the half of the show that's moderately okay at knowing history, Derek, joined by my friend, the guy who does all of the hard stuff so I don't have to, Tim.
Hey!
And we're joined today for the first time in podcast history with a guest, our friend Jeff. How are you two doing
I don't know what they said about friends. They bribed me with alcohol.
tonight?
Just a little context on Jeff's involvement. Tonight is our Black History Month episode, and as me and Derek are white, we have not been affected by that. So we bring someone who, while not American, has at least experienced that plight. So we wanted someone's insight. So here's Jeff, our friend.
I'm here to say the N-word when they can't say the N-word.
I wasn't ready!
I'm joking. No one's going to be saying the N-word. We don't give out those cards anymore. We've seen the mistakes.
Jeff is he's a friend of ours from school. We did bribe him with alcohol to be here. Jeff, you're from Haiti. You're ancestrally from Haiti, but you grew up in Nassau, right, in the Bahamas.
For the most part, I grew up on an island called Exuma.
Okay, yeah.
I'm from an island called Exuma. And our capital is named after some British dude, George. After I graduated high school, I moved to Nassau, where I had the time of my life. And then somehow made it all the way to Oklahoma. Do I regret it?
Welcome to our slice of hell.
Slice of hell. It's not really hell. It's kind of more like, a bad rug burn. Not bad enough that you...
So, Derek, what are you drinking tonight?
Oh man, I cheaped out. I finally got around to actually buying stuff for the podcast this time around because I actually had. I've got for my sipper. I've got Native Amber, which is made by Co-op Ale Works here in OKC. Which it's an IPA, and I normally don't like IPAs. I didn't know it was an IPA when I got it, but it's pretty good. I'll probably be going back to it. I like it. For my shot, I just grabbed the cheapest bottle of spiced rum I could find. It's original Barbarossa spiced rum. It says at the bottom imported rum, and then on the back it says it's made in Louisville, Kentucky. So let's make of that what you will.
Alrighty, Jeff, what are you drinking tonight?
I am drinking something cheap as well. Your boy, for his sipper, is sipping on some Jack Daniel Southern Peach. Contains exactly 4.8% alcohol, 10 fluid ounces. And for our big boy drink of the night, I have a mixture of Wales Pineapple Paradise Original Rum. Contains 24% alcohol. And mix it with a little orange soda because I drank the pineapple soda because I couldn't help myself. It's pineapple.
And tonight, I was originally going to be sipping on some Brother Thelmionas, or however, it's a Belgian-style Abbey Ale. But I found out it only had about 2 cups worth it, and we tried to record one other night, and I drank the 1 cup the other night. So, that didn't end up happening. So I'm actually having my backup beer, which is Berry Bliss. It's a blackberry sour ale. I love sours by Welltown Brewing here in Tulsa. If the smell's anything to go off, it's going to be delicious. And then for my shots, as I'm a tequila, I wouldn't say connoisseur, but lover, I've got Cardores, something like that.
Tonight we're doing a subject that everybody's heard of. Everybody knows her name, but nobody knows much about her besides like the stories like you learn in like elementary school. We're talking about Harriet Tubman.
Oh, hell yeah.
Who honestly, I'm going to be completely honest here. All of the love that John Brown gets for his abolitionist work, they should be giving to Harriet Tubman.
Oh no, there's no way they're gonna ever do that.
Oh no.
Because understand what she did. She not only just escaped, but funneled hundreds, if not thousands, of black people away. These people won't admit that, an unborn fetus isn't a child. Why would they admit a woman did this to them, let alone a black woman who wasn't supposed to be able to read, write, or hold a gun? But Miss Tubman always keep that thing on her. Yes, she did.
She did, yeah.
She did.
Fuck around, find out. Harriet style.
So, getting into our rules this week. So, the first rule is anytime white people are on some white people shit, we take one sip.
That's right. We're going to be sipping a lot because this is America.
I think that's going to be Jeff's rule to enforce. I know I'm the drink enforcer, but Jeff's the authority on that.
Yeah, Jeff's going to be the authority on this one. Rule number 2, anytime Christians actually do something good, we take 3 sips, this is one of those stories where that actually comes up quite a lot, surprisingly.
All right. You really? All right. I got a real question for you. I want to put a stipulation on that. Right. I want to put a stipulation on that particular rule. All right. If it's white Christians doing good, we take 5 sips. If it's if it's black Christians doing good, we take 3.
Okay. Yeah, it works for me.
All right. And today's third and final rule is anytime today's subject does something badass, we take a shot.
Hell yeah, brother.
And Mama Tubman, we believe.
In Mama Tubman, we trust. Prost.
Kampai.
Dilly dilly, boys.
The institution of chattel slavery first came to what would become the United States in the year 1619, which is probably a year you've heard associated with that. What that year, whenever you see that year used in the context of like the history of slavery in the U.S., it's referring to in the year 1619, there was a privateer ship which stopped at a port near the English colony of Jamestown, Virginia. That ship had been at sea for about a year at this point and was in desperate need of repairs so that it would be able to make the transatlantic trip back over to Europe. So as payment for the services, the captain auctioned off all of the stock of cargo that he had seized from Portuguese ships that they had raided in the Gulf of Mexico. The cargo of that ship consisted of about 20 or 25 people from the kingdom of Mdongo in Southwest Africa who had been kidnapped by Portuguese raiding parties in what's now today, that area of Africa is now the nation of Angola. This first arrival was only the first of many more ships that came bringing kidnapped African people to the coast of the United States.
Well, I would think so. I mean, if not, bro, someone got to start some explaining and do why all these black people here. Like, what's really going on? Did they get?
They just like to have. They had a lot of kids back then, man.
Calm down before we get into some Republican anti-slavery denial shit.
Oh, I that's why I stopped myself. I don't want anyone to ever confuse me for Kanye West.
Did you know that Kanye West actually said that Harriet Tubman never freed a single person?
Oh, fuck.
Damn.
Yeah. This injection of cheap labor, of course, like you have enslaved people. Oh, you pay the initial cost up front, and then after that, all you have to do is pay for housing and food for them. After that, you don't have to pay them anything, and you can skimp out on that pretty hard. So they're pretty cheap.
It's essentially just cattle, like you said, cattle slavery.
Yeah,
that's you essentially buy a tool that's gonna work
until you break it. That's how they treated slaves.
Yeah, except this tool is going to make you more tools, depending on you if you can get the right type of dude to go around slinging that thing, or if you got some of them pesky motherfuckers who wasn't getting none of them sweet white coochie at the time and felt the need and the urge to go touch a little black girl or boy.
Oh my god. So all of this cheap labor now being imported into the English colonies basically just supercharged the blossoming plantation economy. And soon after 1619, enslaved Africans were just flooding into the East Coast. After generations of white colonists lived and died with the consequences of slavery literally in their backyard, a culture and an ideology of white supremacy grew up naturally over time just to justify the social exclusion and the economic exploitation of black people in American society, especially in the southern colonies where their labor was so integral to the economic system that they often outnumbered white folk in some areas.
I find it really funny that the statement says it the ideology of white supremacy was brought naturally. I don't think it was brought naturally because the true nature of the Southern man and woman is of the evangelicalness. And if you're going to pretend to be an evangelical, at some point you're going to start seeing the little dots saying all men and women were created equal or all men were created equal, right? So I feel as if when someone, especially in these generations today, while like people back away from religion, is because they saw the evil that is within that bullshit that never really happened. It didn't happen naturally.
Yeah, when I say it grew like when it grew naturally, I meant it grew like it just it was an outspringing of the conditions in which they lived. They had to develop it to justify what it was they were doing. And over time be like they genuinely believed a lot of that stuff. Some of them didn't, some of them were cynical, but a big enough portion of them did that it it made up like a big part of the just the ideology and like the cultural zeitgeist of the southern white during this period that we're talking about, the colonial period going into like the early United States. And of course, due to the nature of the demographics of the South, this sort of white supremacy was not, it was, like I said, not just an incidental quirk of life, it was an integral pillar of Southern society. And as time progressed, it became more and more, I want to say esoteric. I'm not sure what the right word is, but basically it started to become more paranoid and disconnected from reality. Like it like especially when you start getting to the late 1700s, you have like the Haitian Revolution, you have the growth, like the budding growth of like the early abolitionist movement, and a lot of like early or a lot of like those later white southern planters started to kind of feel like they were under siege, like the institution of slavery that they relied on for their livelihood was being attacked, and the threat of like this huge population of enslaved people was like one day they decide to do what Haiti did, and none of them were going to make it out. There's some of that happening.
Yeah, yeah, but that's what happened. Like,
That is, yeah, it did happen in Haiti. That is exactly what happened. So it wasn't, and
let me give you a proverb of the past, the present, and the future that is to come when it dictates to people of color. Okay, here's an old African proverb, right? A child that is rejected by its village is doomed to burn it down to feel the warmth that it never had growing up. What happened in Haiti? All their shit got burned down. All they got kicked out and they lost, right? In retaliation, Haiti got embargoed. No trade could happen. They were stuck, essentially hostilized. But they did survive. What happens in America? Every time a black group tries to a group of persons of color try to climb up, burnt down to the ground, rejected, destroyed each and every single time. Tulsa, Black Wall Street, the lake inside, was it Mississippi? No, Atlanta, Lake Lanier, I think. Friggin' the park inside New York that was a thriving black community until it was bulldozed. At some point, we're gonna get tired of being left outside in the cold. And whether we get the warmth from a fireplace or burning house, hey, it is what it is. And the same thing has been happening.
yeah, yeah, and that's something that I think about a lot. Is that at the end of the day, those kinds of revolts and those kinds of the changing of the historical changing of the guard. It's completely something that the people who are doing the injustice. It's absolutely something that they choose to happen, whether they realize it or not.
It's it amazes me the amount of justification and like lack of introspective that people who were racist, xenophobic, and all that shit have, because it just takes a couple seconds of just like actually critical thinking to realize what the fuck am I doing?
Yeah, it. I mean, there's a reason why even like a lot of people like to say, well, it was the times, it was different times. People had different ideas. I'm like, you look, you,
Yeah, so why is it still happening today then?
so fast forward, we get to like the American War for Independence. You've got major political divisions centered around the topic of slavery. That's like that it in like the early United States. That was one of like the central like dividing lines in like party politics. Um, it's mostly centered around like the balance of trying to balance out the number of free and slave states in the expanding western frontier. As they added more states, they wanted to balance out one. If they add one free state, they have to add one slave state so that there's no like lopsidedness within like the Senate for representation.
Bureaucracy with people's lives, even in today's settings.
In the South, you had, of course, your aristocratic ruling class of plantation owners whose wealth was derived from slavery, and which that
You know, it's funny that that's still happening today, isn't it?
there are a sizable number of people still in politics that derive their wealth from shit very similar to that. Um, and then in the North, you had a political scene that was started to be dominated by growing classes of like merchants and the new like industrial capitalist class, and they were seeking to expand their industrial interests to new markets. That ambition ran afoul of the archaic agrarian economic model of the Southern plantation system.
Break that down for me, Kimo Wasabi.
So you had people who made their money off of factories in the north, and they wanted more factories in the south. They couldn't build more factories in the south because that it was a plantation slave economy. And so uh, abolitionism became a big thing amongst a lot of like industrial capitalists, which at the time were a very new thing.
Oh, that's funny. I'm sorry, but I find it funny that in the pursuit of money, that they took that's what it took someone to be like, damn, I could make more money if I get more factories down here. Someone's like, no, you won't build that shit down here. I got all my slaves down here. That dude was like, fuck you and your slaves. I'm making more money. The other guy was like, no, fuck you and your money. I'm making money off these slaves, which led to what we are today. That's hysterical.
It sounds very capitalist, though.
Yeah, it's such a weird situation in history because like a lot of those people could not care less. A lot of those capitalists could not care less about black people, but it was getting having so much cheap labor and having such an economy oriented towards plantations was getting in the way of being able to expand their market interests. So,
It's even funnier because it's still coming back around because now you have big companies. I'm not going to name drop because I can't afford no lawsuits. Trying to build not only entities for business but now building housing along with these business entities. So you no longer have to go home. You don't have to have this work life balance. You can just
oh yeah, yeah, we're circling back around to like company towns, which is basically they're trying to recreate the plantations. Yeah. So over the decades of the early 19th century, the early 1800s, the ideals of abolitionism were slowly growing from a fringe extremist concept into more of like a mainstream pillar of northern politics. Partially because of the interests of this growing industrial class, and partially because of the activism of a lot of uh, like there were a lot of white people up there who like genuinely felt that slavery was an evil. A lot of them were very religious. They were heavily informed by like their Christian faith, and like you see it time and time again reading about that period. Like abolitionism was very intimately tied into like northern Christian ideals, and like
Yes, but now, but sorry for interrupting. But if you look at it now, the Christian faith has been so interjected with the other side that there's no long because there's no way you can truly be a good faith Christian. See all the evil that goes on in the world and says, you know what, God wanted that to happen to those people, and that so it happened. But the second some minor inconvenience, it's not a message from God. It's divine retribution for them goddamn Antifa people, or in the previous case, it would be the abolitionist. Uh, they at least they learned a lesson to beat to make sure that people can't they gotta take the God out the equation.
yeah, and like the opposite was happening in the South too. Like Christianity very heavily informed, like it was very heavily used to justify the institution of slavery as well. It was
What was it? The Black People's Bible.
yeah, the slave Bible. They specifically wrote a version of the Bible that omitted all of the parts about like emancipation and jubilee, and specific like and kept in all of the parts about like being obedient to your masters and stuff like that. So yeah, it's similar theologies in the North and South being used to justify opposite positions. So because of this growing abolitionist movement in the North, Southern planters responded to this growing movement for social reform in the only way that conservatives really know how to, which is paranoid conspiracism.
To this day.
To this day. To this day.
To this day, Southern Southern politics became dominated by the specter of a nation completely taken over by free blacks who they believed would create like a nightmare of crime and disorder should they have their shackles removed. They thought that if slavery was abolished, black people would reign free. You'd have mobs of freemen wandering the countryside looking for white women to assault, that kind of thing. But so it's this America where we find ourselves in it was actually in the northernmost slave state in the nation, which was Maryland. It borders Pennsylvania to its north, and it shares a peninsula on the Atlantic coast with its fellow slave state, Delaware, and Virginia to the south. Our story begins with a woman named Harriet Green, who is known as Rit to her friends. Rit was an enslaved woman, possibly. It's possible she might have been descended from the Ashanti people in Africa. They're from the modern nation of Ghana. We're not sure though. That was just a rumor that was in their family lore. She was a housekeeper for her owners. The her owners were a family called the Pattisons, specifically Mary Pattison and her son Edward Brodus. They lived in Dorchester County, Maryland. Mary Pattison's husband, or I'm sorry, Rit's husband was Benjamin Ross, who was also an enslaved man. He was a woodworker and a handyman who was owned by Mary Pattison's second husband, which is how the two came to meet. The two of them got married, and together they would end up having 11 children.
God damn. I
And
know it wasn't a lot for back then, but 11 kids is. Oh my.
As I
Jeff says as he's one of like, was it 11?
bitch, I'm number 20.
Oh, yeah. Shit. God damn.
one of their children was a girl, one of their middle children. We're not sure the exact like number of like what her placement was in the children, but uh, They had a baby girl born sometime around 1820. We're not exactly sure. They named her Araminta Ross. Her nickname was Minty. History, of course, knows her better by her free name, Harriet Tubman. As you could probably expect from a life in slavery, young Minty didn't have what we would consider to be a very stable childhood. No. The threat of being quote unquote sold down the river and having her family broken up, which being sold down the river meant like whenever an enslaved person was sold off and all of their family were stayed, but they were sold off separately and had to go. Usually what that meant was that the family that they're having to leave behind because they were sold, they never see each other again. And
Another reason why enslaved, beyond just the moral things, why slavery was fucked.
yeah, it's a nightmare. This is a fucking nightmare. I can't we just because it's such a big part of our history and we hear about it so much when we're talking about American history, a lot of Americans, at least white Americans, can kind of get desensitized to it.
That's why they started taking it out of the history classes.
Right, yeah.
And why they get mad about critical race theory.
Right, because they don't see what the big deal is because they've heard it so much. They're like, yeah, it happened. People know about it. Why do we need to teach it to our kids? But then you need to actually look at it and like you need to really, really process like how horrific this is.
Well, what's crazy is everyone thinks the whitewashed version of what they heard in school is what actually happened and thinks there's no more deeper meaning on it. Like, oh, yeah, we just kept these people in chains for a while, but nothing else really bad happened. When I guarantee you there are people out there who think slavery was just, oh, indentured servitude, basically.
Which, yeah, even then, like indentured servitude was a nightmare too.
It's fucked.
Yeah, not as bad as chattel slavery, but all of this stuff is whitewashed. Nobody gives it like the proper weight it actually deserves. Anyways, the threat of being sold down the river and having her family broken up hung over the Ross family every day. By the time that Araminta is an adult, two of her siblings will have already been sold away.
That's just disgusting.
But Rit and Ben were both fighters. They both were very conscious of their situation and were very eager to resist in any way that they could. Since they were both skilled workers, Ben was a handyman and Rit worked in the house. They had a little bit of leverage against their masters that a lot of like the field workers didn't have. One of Minty's earliest memories was of her mother Rit threatening. She actually threatened their master Edward Brodus with a stick whenever one day he tried to come by and sell one of her sons to a slave trader from Georgia, and she threatened him with a stick, and it worked. He ended up canceling the sale, and they were allowed to stay together.
Bro, imagine that. A black woman with a stick is more powerful than a white woman. The fear of getting your ass whooped by some old lady with a stick is enough to be like, you know what? I'm not going to sell your son.
She knew better than to run that fade. She knew she was going to get clocked out, and she was like, okay, that's fine.
The two of them, their defiance was in large part informed by their faith. They were very deeply devout Christians. It was enormous.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
You can't be a real good Christian and see evil being conducted every single day and be like, oh no, that's just fine. That's that's what God wants. Nah, you gotta feel it down in the fucking pit.
Yeah. This whole story is just filled with like Christianity done right. That's a big through line through this whole story. Despite the fact that both Rit and Ben, they were both illiterate, and on top of that, their masters didn't allow them to attend church. They could both recite verses from the Bible verbatim, like chapter number, verse number, all of it. They could recite it verbatim just from what they had heard through like their clandestine prayer services that they would hold on the plantations. And they often talked about and described their situation being enslaved in biblical terms, and they referred to freedom from bondage as quote unquote life beyond the land of Egypt.
Damn.
Yeah.
Keep that in mind. That is going to come back up again. Starting at age 5, Minty began being loaned out by her master to neighbors for different kinds of work. Her very first job was as a caretaker for a white woman's newborn when she was 5 years old,
God dang.
put in charge of taking care of a newborn.
That's worse than the parents making the siblings rape the youngest sibling.
Minty ended up being repeatedly whipped for, as the white woman described it, negligence every time that the baby cried. So every time the baby cried, which is what babies do, Minty would be whipped for it. And it ended up leaving these deep scars all over her neck and back that she carried with her for the rest of her life. When she was young, she was always described as a very sickly child, which was almost certainly due to like neglect and abuse, of course.
Of course.
But she also learned how to resist, at least in like small ways, like these little acts of defiance that kind of helped her keep going. She would steal lumps of sugar from kitchens when nobody was watching. If she knew that she was going to be whipped, she would put on several layers under her clothes, like several layers of shirts under her clothes, so that when she was whipped, it would soften the blows.
Shit, I used to do that as a kid.
Yeah.
I'm gonna get my ass beat. All right, time to put on 2 bands. Now, mind you,
One time, Minty, one time her master, one of these masters that she was loaned out to, tried to whip her, but before she could be whipped, she ran up and bit her master in the knee.
What the ballsy a much?
knee jerk.
And apparently that master never tried to whip her again after that because it was too much trouble. It worked.
It worked. Hell yeah.
Despite her poor health early on, she ended up growing into she was very strong, very athletic woman. Going into her teenage years, they realized pretty quickly, like right around the time she turned 12 or 13, she was too much trouble for housework. So they sent her out to the fields. And she was perfectly in her element doing field work. She became very like physically strong. She had very good endurance. She was very athletic. She also learned to be a very skilled outdoorsman and how to live off the land, stuff like that, which is all skills that she would need later on in her future endeavors. She could do the same heavy lifting and physical work that any of her male counterparts could do. And all of her masters described her work ethic as phenomenal. She was always on the ball with her work. They described her as like always going above and beyond in everything that she did. Which, for what it's worth, coming from people who own her, whatever that means,
I can tell you what that means if you want to know.
made them lots of money. Yeah,
Yeah, that girl Minty right there. That girl, she make me 2 5 cents. You know, she make me $1.50. Now, in these old days, $1.50 ain't a lot, but back in those days, $1.50 was a lot. Minty was like a working horse. You know, I could lend her, bro. The equivalent of being like, I don't remember if you guys ever saw like it's an old cartoon about chickens, and like once the chickens are laying eggs, but once they stop, you kind of like fucking cut their head off and then make them into like chicken pot pie. So the equivalent is I could either work my ass off and be like, okay, he'll keep me alive longer and not give me away, or I cannot work my ass off. They already kicked me out the house, and they're looking for a reason to give me away.
yeah, that makes sense actually. As she got into her teenage years, she took after her parents. She became a very devout Christian and would remain a very devout Christian till the day she died. And that's probably also why her sense of like her defiance against her situation stuck with her even as she grew older. One of the more famous stories about her, like one of the few things that people do know about her, was she was only 12 years old when this happened. An argument had broken out between an overseer and a field worker. This field worker had just wandered off of the plantation, was heading to like a store somewhere. I don't know what he was doing, but he wandered off the plantation without permission. He was heading to like a local store. The overseer followed him on, like chased him to the store. And Minty, knowing that there would be trouble, wanted to try and defuse the situation so nobody got hurt. And so she followed after them. The overseer was trying to physically attack the man who had walked off the plantation. And so Minty tried to step in between the two of them. And as soon as she stepped in the way, the overseer had grabbed a metal weight and had tried to throw it at the field worker. And instead, it ended up striking Minty in the head. It fractured her skull, leaving an open gash several inches wide on her right temple. And it nearly killed her. She was bedridden and in and out of consciousness for weeks. But she did eventually recover, though she did have lasting effects from it. For the rest of her life, she suffered from fainting spells. A lot of historians speculate it was probably narcolepsy. She would lose consciousness for a little bit, sometimes for several minutes. And if when it was really bad, it would happen 3 or 4 times a day. During these periods of unconsciousness, she said that she would have vivid dreams. She described them as like visions. And because of her faith, she interpreted these visions as messages from God. So sometimes they were kind of, you know how dreams can be. Sometimes they were just benign, but often they were really really like scary nightmares. One recurring dream that she had, one of these recurring visions that she had, was it depicted a posse of men on horseback sweeping onto a plantation and kidnapping all of the children, all of the enslaved children, while their mothers wept. That was one that came to her a lot, even like further through her entire life.
Probably because it's something she probably saw and experienced as a child. That's
Exactly. Jeff's right on the money.
Yeah, she had. Oh yeah, it came up a lot. She had a lot of anxiety about the idea of when she was younger, her being sold off and taken away from her parents, and then when she got older, seeing some of like her nieces and nephews being sold off and taken away.
That can we talk about for a second, not too long, about how fucking devastating that had to have been to see your family just sold and treated like cattle and just shipped off to who knows where against their will. It's hard enough when like your family like willingly moves away for whatever reason, but to see it against their will would have been devastating, I imagine.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, compound that by thousands or tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of times that this happened over the.
and then you gotta like you gotta take into consideration. Sometimes your family member might just be down the road, and one day Master sends you down to this fucking drugstore, and there you see your brother, sister, mom, dad, niece, cousin being whipped to fucking death, or you finally find some way to communicate by them because someone was going in between the two plantations, and someone just did some. Your cargo was killed on the way there because there were people who just did not like the sight of black people and just would kill them regardless if they're enslaved or not. If you didn't, so not seeing, the only way to be sure during those days that someone was alive was to physically see them and speak to them. So
It was good as seeing them have a death census, what you're saying?
yeah, because sometimes like you go from one plantation to the other. When people really want to make money and don't care about their tools, they'll do terrible, terrible things. And a lot of people did not see black enslaved people as tools. They were, I mean, as people, they were nothing more than tools. So you know what? Your niece gets sent off. She's 5 years old. She ain't doing good inside the house. She ain't doing good on the field. Guess what? You're going to use her as a breeding horse. At that young age, if she could actually give birth, and there'll probably be a shit ton of complications because it ain't like medicine back then, especially for black people, black women, like was any good at all.
That actually reminds me something that I didn't initially include in the script, but I guess I'll go ahead and mention it here. Maryland was was a little bit different from some of the other slave states. Its economy wasn't. It was more of like a coastal state, so it didn't have as much room for like large sprawling plantations. So what what the slave economy in Maryland specialized in was slave breeding. And like their main export was enslaved people to the other slave states.
Because at some point in time, sla- the Atlantic slave trade stopped, so you couldn't bring any more slaves into the country, and you had to like make your own slaves.
Yeah, I think it was outlawed in the United States importing people from Africa. I think that was 1798 or either that or like 1808.
That was way earlier than I was expecting.
Oh yeah, it was super early. It's a big reason why this divide happened so early in
What's funny is like Americans like to think, we were just as bad as other countries or blah blah blah. Most countries that were considered on our level outlawed slavery many decades before we did.
Nah, not even that. You guys outlawed slavery, and then the next thing you know, there's still pockets of slavery still exhibiting. Juneteenth, anyone? Still, like, don't forget what it was. What was it? There was still
I didn't even know about Juneteenth until NEO, Jeff. That's how bad Oklahoma is.
nah.
I didn't know about I didn't know about Juneteenth until conservatives made it a culture war issue. When Minty was in her early 20s, she met and married a free black man named John Tubman. The two of them got married when she was sometime in her early 20s, sometimes in the like early to mid 1840s.
I didn't. The way you started the episode, I thought her Harriet Tubman was a completely assumed name, not like okay, the first name is assumed and the rest is a married name.
No, the name that she takes when she escapes from slavery is going to be Harriet, which is her mom's name, and Tubman, which is her married name. But at this point, she's still at this point she's going by Araminta Tubman, but technically she's not legally married to him because it was illegal for
I assumed it wasn't a legal marriage because legal marriages weren't very common for African Americans at that time.
So the term we're looking for is jumping the broom.
so Minty married John Tubman. And okay, so this is going to get confusing, so let me try and explain it. The two of them left to live with Minty's father, Ben, in Caroline County, Missouri.
Had they escaped at this time, or were they sent off?
They had not escaped yet. I'll explain. Ben had been freed in 1840,
Okay.
and he had actually taken a job with his former master, like a paid job as the manager of his new lumber business. And they were running that business out of Caroline County. And so since the Pattisons and Edward Brodus were still close because, like his stepdad, he agreed to uh allow Minty to go work for uh work for Ben's former master, now boss, in this new like lumber business they were setting up. And so now and he also allowed Rit to go and live with them too. So it's Rit, Ben, and daughter Minty with her new husband John Tubman, and they're living in Caroline County. So living in Caroline County gave Minty a little bit of a taste of freedom. She wasn't free, but she didn't. Yeah, she didn't have an overseer breathing down her neck now, and she was also able to, like, when she was off hours, she was able to go and do odd jobs around town, and she started to get her own little income going. She started to get a little bit of her own money.
I'm assuming she was hoping to buy her freedom.
Not not at this point. That wasn't an idea that she had yet, but she was thinking about freedom. What she decided to do instead was she had heard a rumor that there was some sort of legal loophole involving like the will of Mary Pattison. Edward Brodus, his mother, Mary Pattison. She had inherited Rit and all of Rit's kids from her father. And oh god, I'm trying to keep this as straight as possible. Um, Minty had heard a rumor that there was some sort of loophole in the will of this guy who had left Rit and her kids to Mary Pattison, and that if they could find that loophole, then they could get their freedom somehow, like legally. And so Minty saved up enough money. She got $5 And she used that $5 to hire a lawyer to start poking around for any of these loopholes that they could find, which would allow Rit and her kids to be freed. To everybody's shock, they didn't find a loophole. They found something so much worse.
Were they actually supposed to be free and they just ignored the will?
They were actually supposed to be free at this point.
I do believe. Hold up. I do believe that is some white people shit.
That is some white people shit. Yeah.
Was it 3 steps?
White people shit is one.
Sip.
So yeah, when Mary Pattinson's father had died, he had put in his will that Rit and all of her kids were supposed to be freed when Rit turned 45. Rit was 55 at this point. And Mary Pattison had died before Rit turned 45, and Edward Brodus had just covered up the will.
Oh, that dirty dog.
That bitch.
This, of course, fucked Minty up pretty bad. She became convinced that there was no legal path to freedom, because if this was allowed to happen, then the legal system was going to fail them every time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Damn, Minty saw the future.
She started to become even more paranoid that she would end up being sold off. And this constant anxiety caused her relationship with John to start to suffer.
Can you blame her though?
Absolutely not, no. She prayed. She had a habit of praying several times a day. And during these prayers, she started asking God to strike down Edward Brodus. And you're not going to believe it.
Did he fall down dead?
God answered. And he said yes.
Was that 2 shots for the Christian?
I would say that counts as Christian African American because you adjusted our rules, Jeff, doing good Christian stuff. So based on the rule, I think that's 3 sips.
Yep. Okay. So yeah, this motherfucker keeled over dead. I think it was from like a heart attack. I can't remember for sure, but keeled over dead in 1849.
Couldn't have happened to a better man.
He was only 47 years old. This motherfucker.
Yeah, and look at that. He 47. 2 years later than he was supposed to fucking release Harriet. How did that for an extra 10 mother trucking years? And God was like, all right, bro, I'm gonna give you 2. 1 for every 5 years.
So in the chaos, in the aftermath of this, the chaos of trying to work out the inheritance within the Brodus family, Minty was convinced that she was going to be sold off by whoever inherited her.
Probably was.
There was a good chance. So, but everything was chaotic at this point within the Brodus family. She saw it as an opportunity, and so she took it. She packed up a few provisions and she fled in the middle of the night. She went to she left the patent, not the plantation. She was still at the lumber mill at this point. So she left this lumber mill. She ran to a local family that were rumored to be abolitionists.
Ah.
And she left her whole family and her husband behind. Next, I'm going to read to you a clipping from a newspaper in Maryland called the Cambridge Democrat. This was an ad from that paper that in their issue that they published on October 3rd, 1849. Reward for the recovery of escaped slave. Minty, aged about 27 years old, is of chestnut color, fine looking, about 5 feet high. Ran away on September 17th. Reward $50 for capture and return if located in Maryland. $100 if found out of state. This notice was signed by Edward Brodus's widow, Eliza Ann Brodus.
Ba 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 ba. She a bitch.
You're right. This notice was probably the last time that she was ever publicly recognized by her birth name. As with many escaped slaves, she adopted a new name to throw off her track. She kept her husband's last name, of course. She was still very deeply devoted to him, even though they were kind of drifting apart there at the end. And she had left without him, but she was still, Christian woman, married for life. She still felt very devoted to him. So she kept the last name, adopted her mother's first name, And so that's how she became Harriet Tubman. As it turns out, the house that she had fled to was indeed an abolitionist house. More than that, by sheer luck, it also happened to be doubling as a train station for a very, very special, very, very secret railroad. So let's talk about this for a second. The Underground Railroad had started out as a loose connection of abolitionists who would illegally provide food and temporary housing to escaping slaves. And this network kind of dated back to at least the 1780s. Over time, all of these separate sorts of efforts began to form formal networks. They adopted code words and like a formal code of conduct. The way it worked basically was that you would have a series of what they called stations. And stations were specific buildings, usually houses, that were designated as safe houses for escaping slaves during the day. And these stations would be run by station masters. Conductors would ferry their quote unquote cargo, aka the escaping slave, from station to station by cover of night until they reached the promised land, quote unquote, which was aka their stopping point. That would either be a northern free state or all the way up into Canada. The railroad was run by a mix of free blacks and white abolitionists, and it was mostly organized through churches.
That's probably Christians doing something good.
That it we're talking about both black and white. So you want to meet in the middle and do four?
Sure.
Yep. So the bulk of the white railroad operators were Quakers. Tim, we talked about Quakers in our episode about Smedley Butler.
Yep.
They also included Congregationalists, which are like your basically like the descendants of Puritans. Basically, you had your Congregationalists, you had your Methodists, you had your Presbyterians, a few Episcopals, and even shockingly, a few Baptists. Like there was actually a schism in the Southern Baptist Church in the 1840s between abolitionists and pro-slavery Baptists, and a small. By the start of the Civil War, the Underground Railroad had helped over 40,000 enslaved people to freedom. And in the fall of 1849, Harriet Tubman became one of their passengers. So, after the trek, most likely with slave catchers on her the whole way, she finally found herself in a free state when she arrived in the city of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the following month. Philadelphia was a really good place for an escaped slave to be. It had
So was it one of the most the most progressive states at the time?
absolutely not, no.
Wow.
Philadelphia, the city of Philadelphia specifically, was a good place because it had the largest population of free black people in the country. Almost 20,000 people. She was able to seamlessly blend into the black community there. It was really once an escaped slave hit Philadelphia, it was really hard to find them after that. And Philadelphia it's in the northeast corner of Pennsylvania. It's really close to the border with Maryland. So it's kind of like the first big city that you run into if you're escaping from slavery, which is a big reason why it has such a large free black population. So she settled in, she began working odd jobs to make a little bit of a living, and more importantly, she started to become acquainted with the leaders of the abolition movement in Philadelphia. Most prominently, she became friends with William Still, who was a free black man from New Jersey, whose mother had been an escaped slave and he was at that time a clerk for the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society, which was the largest abolitionist group in the country at the time. He was also clandestinely the chief organizer of the Underground Railroad trails that passed through Philadelphia. Another abolitionist that she became friends with was Thomas Garrett.
Sounds like she knew, like, obviously since she's such a neurophobia, she had to have, but she knew like all the top people right away.
Well, I don't think like she knew all the top people right away. It's more of you're because remember, if you're an escaped slave, you're trying to get here. You don't want to stick out, so everyone kind of knows you, especially since Derek said that he was a child of a former his mother was enslaved, so he probably knew a lot of people back from his mom's plantation, and then her escaping. More than likely, a lot of these things were still connected to the church, so she probably knew of him before.
As far as I can tell, his mom, that guy William Still, his mom had actually escaped from a plantation in Virginia. Um, so it was very unlikely that the two of them had any prior.
Oh no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying like him what William still watching his mother, also like growing up, her telling stories of her condition, probably inspired him to start reaching out to see how much people he can truly help, and being involved in that type of livelihood because like you said, Philadelphia is probably the first stop when you get away from Maryland. So your mom probably escaped from one of the surrounding states that did encourage slavery during that time, and you probably have met a few people through your mom, and just gone along with it.
Yeah, yeah, that's accurate. That, as far as I can tell, that's um, he did definitely get involved in abolitionist activism, uh, because he didn't know that his mother was an escaped slave until he was already an adult, and it kind of changed the trajectory of his life. It was after he found out. He was like 20. After he found out, he decided to move to Philadelphia and get involved in abolitionist work. But yeah, a reason why she was able to meet so many of like the big people in charge was just because the circles of the active abolitionist movement, like the actual activists, was pretty small. And so anybody who is in charge of it, uh, if you were involved even in the slightest, including people who came through the railroad, it was very likely that you'd meet a lot of these people who were like the actual big names in it.
Yeah, because it's not like the day where you have a business, so you have a CEO, then you have a bajillion people under him working. No, you have to do this shit yourself, and if anyone caught you, that was on you.
Yeah. Another guy that she met was and became friends with was Thomas Garrett, who was a white Quaker who was in charge of organizing the railroad networks in Delaware, which is one of the trails that she took. She um if you're enslaved in Maryland and you go on the Underground Railroad, you went through Delaware up to Philadelphia. So she's doing all this. She's kind of it's been less than a year. She's kind of settling into a rhythm of kind of easing herself into activism in between like these odd jobs to kind of keep herself afloat financially. And in early 1851, she received a letter from her niece's husband. So one of her siblings had a daughter named Kezia, and Kezia had a husband who was a free black man. And her Kezia's husband had sent her a letter saying that Kezia was going to be sold soon. She's going to be sold down the river. And her family and friends back in Harriet's family and friends back in Maryland were expecting her to, now that she was in Philadelphia, they expected her to have maybe some connections that could put her in contact with someone that could help her escape, which she did. And that she probably could have just done that, just told some of the railroad station masters or conductors that Kezia needed to escape, and they could get in contact with her. She decided that she wanted to do it herself. That she was ready. She wanted to get involved in the railroad itself.
Homie really said, "Nah, watch this. I can do it better."
Yeah, she decided that she couldn't stand living by herself so far away from the rest of her family anymore. She decided that she wanted to get involved with the railroad so that she could go and bring the rest of her family to freedom. She wasn't just going to get involved in the railroad. She was actually going to to take on one of the most dangerous jobs in the entire operation of the railroad. So I mentioned some of the other positions before, like the conductors and the station masters. The role that Harriet is about to fill is a position that the operatives in the railroad gave the tongue in cheek name of abductors. So, what abductors were, they were a rare few people that who were involved with the railroad that would actually travel south and seek out enslaved people who wished to escape and then ferry them onto the railroad. So instead of just waiting for an escaping slave to come to them, the abductors would physically go out and find them.
Essentially, abduct slaves.
Yeah, they were called, it was called abducting, but they were only finding people who already wanted to escape, but weren't weren't ready to do it on their own to go and find out the railroad. And so the railroad would go and find them through these abductors. And this was an insanely dangerous job. This was the most abductors ended up being captured and jailed at some point. A lot of them ended up dead. Pretty much all of the abductors that were active at the time were white men, because white men were treated the least severely if they were caught. They had the least at stake. And even then, a lot of them had been killed by slave catchers, and a lot more had served severe prison sentences. Harriet had the most to lose out of any of them. Not only was she a black woman, but she was an escaped slave black woman. And she was voluntarily going back into a slave state. Not just a slave state, the state where she's from, and she will be recognized. If she was caught, which was very likely, it wouldn't just be prison, it would mean either re-enslavement or death. Probably both, because she was not going to be getting any of the easy jobs after that if she were put back in chains. So this first rescue that she carries out, we aren't sure exactly how it happened, but we do know that it went off without a hitch. Kezia and her two children they had already been transported to Baltimore, and they were set to be put on the auction block the next day. What probably happened is that Kezia's husband snuck them out of the storage house where they were being kept in the middle of the night and rowed them by boat, like a rowboat, across the Chesapeake Bay, and then met Harriet on the opposite shore. And then Harriet took them and led them to their first station and eventually led them all the way out. However, badass, yeah.
That's a shot.
That is a shot, yep.
Badass.
Prost.
Kampai.
So, however it happened, Kezia and her two children were safely escorted north. So at this point, Harriet is probably feeling pretty confident now, because only a few months after that, literally like 3 months after that, she made another trip back to Maryland. And she came back with one of her brothers and two other men from the plantation in the plantation she had been born at.
She couldn't be more obvious looking back on it. However, she got away with it, so hell yeah.
Yeah, spoiler alert, she gets away with all of this. And then in the fall of 1851, she made her third trip. This time not only trying to free more of her family, but also to try and convince her husband, John Tubman, to come back to Philadelphia with her. And this trip kind of sucked for her, because when she showed up and she put out her feelers, went through her connections, tried to get a message out to John that she wanted to meet up and she wanted to take him up to Philadelphia with her. She found out that in the 2 years that she had been away, he had gotten remarried.
That fucker.
Motherfucker. So this trip was not as successful, but she wasn't coming back with any free slaves, but she did manage to get back north undetected. Her fourth trip is what really made her legendary in the abolitionist movement. This is what made her name as the famous figure within the Underground Railroad her fourth trip, she ferried 11 people at once out of Maryland,
Wow.
getting them on the Liberty lines and escorting her cargo all the way north to Canada.
God damn.
That's like legendary.
It's believed that it was after this mission that she acquired her most famous alias. It became a her code name within the railroad, and it also became a term of affection from slaves across the South. She began to be called Moses.
I didn't know she had that nickname.
Out here part in the White Sea.
Yeah, that's her famous name that she's known by. She was Moses.
Out here getting the slaves away from the pharaohs and shit. Let my people go.
Yeah, that's the that goes right back to her parents who always talked about life beyond the land of Egypt. It's coming around again. After that, she just kept going.
Well, no, duh. She's doing good. Why wouldn't she?
Oh, she's doing amazing. She is easily the greatest agent the Underground Railroad ever had. She made at least one or two trips every year for the entirety of the 1850s. Her specialty was escorting large groups of people, which most of the abductors, the ones that were active, would only risk taking 2 or 3 people at a time. Every every time Harriet went down, she would get more and more people, 20, 30, 40 people at a time.
That sounds like that badass.
Look at the brass nuts on her. Indeed, take a shot.
Prost.
Kampai.
Literally hundreds of people. Each time she brought more and more people with her across the slave line, across the Mason-Dixon, north into the Promised Land. Hundreds of people. And all of her missions, this is one of the most wild parts. She did these completely alone, by herself. She never had a partner.
Damn.
She became a master of disguise. On a couple occasions, she even evaded detection when there were 2 times this happened. She had one of her former masters from when she was still enslaved, only a couple feet away from her, literally within touching distance, who did not realize it was her because she was so good at keeping herself covered up. One of the ways that she did that was she would sit down at a bench. If she saw like one of her former masters, she sat down at a bench and she pulled out a newspaper and she would pretend to be reading it, even though she was illiterate, because she knew that anybody who recognized her wouldn't bother to look to see if it was, or wouldn't associate her with like an escaped slave, because they knew an escaped slave would be illiterate. It wouldn't be able to read. And so if they saw a black woman reading, they'd assume she was a free black woman because she was able to read. And so she was able to evade being recognized by somebody who literally used to own her, who was standing like 2 feet away from her.
That is like the biggest bluff ever.
It's insane. The fugitives that she transported, universally, they said that while she was on the Liberty lines, she was tough, she was disciplined, she did not take any shit from anybody, even the people that she was helping carry to freedom. She knew that any hesitation on the part of the people she carried was a risk. And so she carried a pistol on every mission. The pistol, of course, was not to fight slave catchers. It was to push forward any of her cargo that started to get cold feet. So if any of the escaping slaves that she was helping transport started to get scared and started talking about like wanting to go back, she'd pull her pistol on them.
Yeah.
She's like, you're being freed whether you like it or not at gunpoint.
Yeah. Yeah. Once they committed, they had to keep going, and she would make sure they kept going no matter what. Out of this, there's this popular myth about her that whenever she was on the Liberty lines, if somebody refused to keep going, she would just shoot them. That is not true. If you hear that, it's not true. She never killed any of the people that she helped escape.
Well, anyone with common sense who know how godly this woman is knows she ain't gonna waste a life.
Oh yeah, she yeah, she respected the life of all of these people way too much to ever put a bullet in them. But she never really needed to either, because every time that she had to, just pulling the pistol on them was enough. This is a crazy story. During one trip, she had an awful toothache, and her gums were starting to swell so bad that she was having trouble talking. And so instead of like taking a break and putting everybody's lives at risk so that she could rest and like take care of her teeth, she just took the butt of her pistol and she knocked her front two teeth out.
Can't hurt it if they ain't there.
Can't hurt if they ain't there. And so she never got dentures or anything. So for the rest of her life, she just didn't have her two front teeth.
That's badass.
It's insane. This woman is incredible. Finally, after she'd already established her career in the Underground Railroad, she finally managed to help her parents get out of Maryland in 1857. She decided to finally go and get her parents after she found out that her father had actually been an agent on the railroad and had been helping. He had been the first station. He had been a station master, and she found out that the authorities had found out that he was a station master and were going to arrest him. And so she helped him and her mother escape and took them up to Canada. And so by the end of the 1850s, the majority of her family were living in Canada. Both of her parents, 5 of her siblings, and all of her siblings' kids. So like a good 20 people or so.
A lot of family is what you're saying.
As she was becoming a living legend in the Northern abolitionist movement, the nation was polarizing even more over the issue of slavery. Uncle Tom's Cabin, the novel, was published in 1852. It became one of the best-selling books in all of human history. At least by that point, it sold 1 million copies internationally in only a year, which at that time was an absurdly high number. The book brought the discussion of abolition out of the meeting halls of activist groups and made it a mainstream Northern political plank. In 1854, Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which the Kansas-Nebraska Act was a repudiation of the earlier Missouri Compromise. It now allowed Western territories to decide whether they would be admitted as a free state or a slave state by a popular vote. As a result, violence around the referendum was growing to a fever pitch and simmering into outright guerrilla warfare in the Kansas territory. And of course, this came to be called Bleeding Kansas. We talked about this a little bit in the Lucy Parsons episode. This of course came to be called Bleeding Kansas, and by far the most famous fighter in Kansas during that time was probably the only other person as dedicated to the freedom of slaves as Harriet Tubman was. The legend himself, John Brown.
John motherfucking Brown.
John motherfucking Brown. The only good white man. Harriet first met Brown in 1858 while they were both in Canada. They immediately became best friends. Literally for the rest of Harriet's life, she would say that the best friend that she ever had was John Brown. They shared a deep hatred of slavery, which was motivated by their faith. They're both very deep, devout Catholics. I just said Catholic. Very devout Christians. That's what I meant. Harriet was the first person to tell John that his plan to instigate a slave uprising and create a multiracial state in the Black Belt was not completely insane. So yeah, here, let me explain this. John Brown's plan was to raid a federal armory, take all of the guns, pass them out to enslaved people, and use them to incite an insurrection across the entirety of the South. And using that insurrection, they would overthrow the planter class, overthrow the state governments, and then they create a new country in the South, which would be this new government would be multiracial, and it would exist solely for the purpose of completely destroying any vestige of slavery left in America. That was his plan. He even had a constitution for this country written out.
I kind of want to see that now.
It's really interesting. He basically the formation of government that he envisioned, it would have like a sort of parliamentary system with like elected representatives from all over the South, but at the head of it would be like a military dictator, and he would be the military dictator at first, and then they'd have like it'd be like a succession type of thing, and like it it's assumed that like in theory like the dictatorship part of it would only last as long as it took to destroy slavery. You know, I sympathize heavily with anarchists and the anarchist tradition, so I'm a little hesitant of the idea, but I can still like I understand. Yeah, Harriet was the literally the very he had told this plan to every major abolitionist in the country at the time, including like Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass had told John that he was insane and that this was a stupid plan and it wouldn't work.
Yeah, because Frederick Douglass only planned to ever go so far to begin with. Let me leave my opinions out of this. I got no proof of that.
Yeah, he was definitely like more on the moderate side of abolitionism as far as that went. He by no means was he opposed to the idea of violence against slave owners or slave catchers. He was very much supportive of the idea of killing slave catchers. That's undisputable. But as far as like political, like in like broader ideology, he was politically a little bit more moderate than people like Harriet and John Brown. But Harriet was literally the very first person to tell him that his idea was not completely insane and was actually a good idea. Which I agree probably was a good idea, wouldn't have worked.
I would. Well, we've seen what happens when we go the soft approach towards everything. So at this point, I'd like to see it work out. It all depends on people being actually good spirited people and be like, all right, now that we've crushed this shit, I can officially dissolve this. I can go get an actual job. This office no longer needs to exist, and now we can.
See, that's the thing. Even if you're wanting, like, hey, we're setting this thing up for temporary sake, eventually someone's like, ooh, I like this power. Like, I know Derek in the past disagreed with me, but I would argue it's human greed, human quote unquote nature just to hang on to power.
Oh no, I don't disagree with you on that. I disagree with you on the idea that like greed is and a desire for power is intrinsic. Once somebody is in
No, 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 no. I never said. I think me and you were off on that. I never said it was intrinsic. I just meant that is what the current conditions necessitate that human nature is.
yeah, my position on it is that once somebody is in power, once they have the power, they have a vested interest in keeping that power, but completely in a vacuum, a human being does not seek out power for its own sake. That is my position. So John Brown's passion had an effect on Harriet as well. After their meeting, they came away not only viewing slavery, she came away viewing slavery not only as a sin against God, but also like from like a militaristic sort of perspective. Like he gave her like sort of a militant I- idea of viewing slavery. She began to see slavery as like an act of war against Black Americans by white planters. And I can only imagine, like, if you lock these two people in a room together for like just lock the two of them in a room together, they would just keep radicalizing each other more and more into like even more elaborate plots to just completely destroy racial prejudice for all time. Like I can't imagine the combustion that would result from having these two people locked in a room together for a few days.
It sounds like it was just like, oh, this thing, then this thing, and just they keep on going higher on the radical ladder.
Yeah, they fed off of each other like crazy. So Harriet started to work in Canada to recruit soldiers into a little army that John was making, and she also started to give him detailed information about the area of Virginia where he was going to raid. Which Harper's Ferry actually happened to be right along one of the Liberty Trails that she was using to ferry enslaved people out of the South. So she already knew the area very well. In letters, this is really weird. The first part isn't weird. The first thing is that in letters, whenever John Brown was talking about Harriet, he referred to her as General Tubman. So he gave her the rank of General Tubman, and that's where she got one of her like her second most famous nickname. She was called the General, and that showed how much respect that Brown had for her, considering he only gave himself the rank of captain.
Dang, it sounds like he was like super respectful of her.
Yeah. The second thing that's a lot weirder is that even though John Brown was really, really opposed to slavery and racial prejudice, he was still pretty sexist. And he respected Harriet so much that he couldn't view her as a woman. And so whenever he wrote about her in letters, he used he, him pronouns.
Sound like he wanted to boink but couldn't do it. So, because it's homie over hose, and Harriet most definitely is homie.
I don't think it was that. I thought about that. I was like, did anything happen between them? But like the way that it sounds, it's like even if there was anything between them, like they'd be too busy discussing how to overthrow like every state government in the South for too much to ever even consider like getting in bed together. I genuinely I don't think there was like a thing between them. I thought about it, but like I just don't think it was there. It I didn't see any hints that that might have been going on. But anyways, it's believed that Harriet was actually planning on joining the raid on Harper's Ferry. But at the time that it was launched in Virginia, she was still in Massachusetts because she was bedridden from an illness probably caused by her head injury. And so she didn't get a chance to go and join the raid on Harper's Ferry. And so, as we know, Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in October of 1859 was a resounding failure. Half of his men were killed, most of the rest fled. No slave revolt happened to relieve them, which was the plan. They were going to attack, and then they were going to get reinforced by local slaves who were going to come and help them. And they never showed up. He ended up being captured, tried, and was hanged for treason on December 2nd, 1859. Harriet was, of course, devastated, having lost both a friend and probably the greatest ally in the cause against slavery that she could ever have. But his martyrdom seemed to inspire her because she became even more militant. The following year, 1860, in Troy, New York, she led an angry mob of abolitionists in a raid on a police station where an escaped slave had been apprehended. And they broke into the jail and they freed the enslaved man. In a sense, this was kind of her first taste of battle. And with war on the horizon, it would not be her last. So let's talk about the American Civil War.
I didn't realize she had like any kind of like play in it.
Oh, let me tell you, dude, she has some play in it. So The conditions that created the American Civil War had been in the process of setting up ever since the American Revolution.
Like they knew what was coming and they just refused to acknowledge it.
Thomas Jefferson saw it coming from a mile away. So all of the dominoes had been set up in the United States for the Civil War since the American Revolution. And John Brown's raid was in many ways kind of the first domino falling. It radicalized the entire nation on the issue of slavery. Everybody had to pick a side. Either Brown was a hero with a just cause, or he was a traitor with an unjust one. You couldn't find yourself in the middle anymore. And in the wave of hatred and unrest, the word of Harriet Tubman's deeds had gained national attention. And in the North, she was, of course, like a hero. People didn't know that she was Harriet Tubman. They didn't know that name yet. Everybody just knew her as Moses. And in the South, Moses was public enemy number one.
Imagine that. I wonder if that's why we have so much white everything, because like Jesus was black, but in the South he was white, and now they got a black Moses. You most definitely know Moses was a white man, even though he's not even in the desert. Moses was out here trying to. Moses told the white man, "Let my people go." God damn it! Before I shoot you.
Moses had green eyes, red hair, and freckles, and nobody can tell me different.
Except for Sister Tubman when she pop up with that blicky.
So the Great American Kindling Pile finally lit when a guy. This guy, he was an abolitionist, kind of, but he was like a very, very moderate abolitionist. This guy you may have heard of. His name was Abraham Lincoln. He was a diet abolitionist.
Oh, he's a diet abolitionist is the term you're looking for. Diet abolitionist. You go out to eat, but the food prices are like in the $30-$40, so you're on a diet. You get like the $10 plate.
Yeah. The Republicans nominated him because they saw him as the compromise between pro slavery and anti slavery. That's how middle of the road he was on abolitionism. But yeah, so he was elected president of the United States. And a month later, South Carolina became the very first state to issue a declaration of secession. More were soon to follow. Everyone knew that war was close at hand. Harriet made one last trip south in December of 1860, rescuing an enslaved couple and their 2 children from what she thought would surely be a reign of terror against black folk in the South. Troops, and she was right, yeah. Troops of the newly formed Confederate States of America fired on the federal installation at Fort Sumter the following April, and the war began. Harriet, the first thing she did in the war was she immediately got involved, and she accompanied General Benjamin Butler and his army when it occupied Maryland and set up Fort Monroe. Maryland had never seceded, but it was still a slave state, and there were a lot of Confederate sympathizers in the state. And so Benjamin Butler's army was sent in by Lincoln to put it under occupation and kind of keep it calm. Because if Maryland decided to secede, then Washington, D.C. would be completely surrounded by slave states. And that was not a situation that they needed.
Indeed. They didn't need the blacks learning how to read, and the whites in the South learning how to count.
So Harriet accompanied Butler's army when it occupied Fort Monroe, which I think it was right by Baltimore. It had actually become a waypoint for slaves who were escaping north from the Confederacy. So as soon as secession started, a bunch of people started to escape, like running away from their plantations because they knew what was coming next.
Was this even before the Emancipation Proclamation?
The Emancipation Proclamation happened halfway through the war. So this was 1861. The Emancipation Proclamation went into effect on January 1st, 1863. So Fort Monroe ended up becoming a waypoint for people escaping from slavery, coming north out of the Confederacy. While she was there, she tended to a lot of refugees. She made food. She provided medical aid, basically anything they needed. And it was very helpful having like a big hero like her around, because people didn't know the name Harriet Tubman, but they knew the name Moses, and people generally knew that she was Moses. So it helped boost morale having somebody like her around. In 1862, she ended up traveling to the recently captured coast of South Carolina. So the Union Army was advancing. They had this blockade going around the entire Confederacy, this naval blockade, and they had captured the coast of South Carolina. She traveled to South Carolina, which also was do what?
You can't forget to give them boys a good old fuck you.
Give them boys a good old fuck you. Um, she traveled to the coast of South Carolina, which had also, just like Fort Monroe, was becoming an even bigger rallying point for enslaved people who were trying to escape to the Union. And she started to work there, trying to coordinate with abolitionist groups up in the North to try and get all of these people relocated up there, find places for them to live up in the North. She also ended up serving as a nurse to Union troops who, I don't know if you know this, South Carolina, pretty humid, pretty swampy. A lot of the Yankees in the Union Army were started to die from disease, like tropical diseases. And so she had her hands full acting as a nurse.
It do be like that. I mean, send someone down from Nebraska to like South Texas, they'll melt. You think it's Frosty the Snowman?
Put somebody from like the Highlands of Scotland into the middle of like Morocco, and they'll just fucking melt.
Every third joke's gonna be their balls sweating.
So on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. The Emancipation Proclamation proclaimed that all people held in bondage, specifically in states which were in rebellion. So this didn't include the border states like Maryland, where slavery was legal, but they had stayed loyal to the Union. This was just the states that were in the Confederacy. Any slave.
So essentially, this the Emancipation Proclamation was simply, "Hey, you guys decided to leave. Fuck you guys."
That's exactly it. Yes. Um,
That's always how it was taught to me, even though I grew up in a small town that probably was pretty biased. It's like, hey, you guys are pissed? Well, okay, we'll do the thing you guys wanted us not to do and thought we were going to anyway.
yeah, and this is kind of the moment where the Civil War in the North became it before the Emancipation Proclamation. The average opinion in the North was that like the average person was, this war is just about putting down a rebellion and keeping the country united. After the Emancipation Proclamation, it became a crusade against slavery. That's when popular opinion in the North swung to like, yes, slavery should be abolished, and this is how we're going to do it, by putting down the rebellion in the South. And so, as you can imagine, Harriet was ecstatic at this news. Can you imagine? Can you imagine having grown up, been born and raised in bondage, having scars on your body left over from the experience, and then finding out that that there is now a government of your country which is finally putting the kibosh on it, is finally saying this is not acceptable and we should be getting rid of this. We can say with hindsight that it didn't go far enough. We could say with hindsight that there were problems with the way that it happened afterward, that we didn't fully, it's a job that was half complete. But even then, like, imagine the from her perspective at the time.
It's like, damn, John Brown died, but his dream lives on.
His soul goes marching on.
Honestly, I can get behind that.
Fucking up old white people that want to be racist.
Sorry about that, y'all. We're having to say goodbye to Jeff. Have a good night, Jeff.
Y'all have a good night. No problem. It has in fact been fun. I will probably be back. Y'all listen to these people. Don't, don't. Black History Month is ending, and I swear to God, other I, it's gotten so bad now that I barely even see the ads about this other than the one Arby's roast beef ad. Being black in America, being black in America is like constantly rolling in that one. I ain't even from America, and I know exactly how tough it is. So y'all got black friends out there, treat them right. Because one of these days they can figure out how to get the fuck up out of here, and then y'all can have no more good tasting food. All that bland ass chicken, no soul food.
Oh
Stop
fuck.
it. Y'all have a nice night, eh? Deuces.
Later, Jeff.
Deuce. Yeah, let's just jump back into this. So Harriet, of course, knew that this. She knew full well that this didn't mean the end to slavery in the U.S. All of the border states still had slaves, but she knew it was the first step towards full and complete abolition. And just as important to her, she was convinced that the promise of freedom for Southern black folk and the inclusion of black troops in the Union Army, she was 100% fully convinced that as soon as the Union started letting black men join the Union Army, that it would be the final nail in the coffin for the Confederacy. And you know what? In a lot of ways, she was kind of right. Like, turning the war away from just the cause of unity towards the cause of abolition was the shot in the arm that the Union needed to win the war in a lot of ways. So at this point, 1863, she was still in South Carolina. She was starting to get a little restless. Her mission at the time was to tend to refugees. That was very important to her. It was a very important cause. She cared about it very deeply. But she thought that her skills were being underutilized. Because think about the kind of skills that she had, very, very rare skills that not a lot of people have. She's basically like the special forces. Like, she was she was a Navy SEAL of the 1800s. That's the kind of skill set she had.
Were they not around at that time?
The Navy SEALs? No, they didn't come around till like the 1960s.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, all of like Navy SEALs, Green Berets, all of the like American Special Forces didn't really come around in like the form that they are today. Like, you had like the Rangers, but they were really different in the past, and they weren't like a solid like actual unit. But yeah, like she had an utterly unique, unreplicable set of skills that only somebody in her position could possibly have. And she thought that it was being underutilized.
It probably was.
Luckily for her, she actually had a couple friends in the army. There were two colonels in the Union Army, which had just these two guys had just been given command of newly raised black regiments. One of them was Thomas Wentworth Higginson. The other one was James Montgomery. Both of these guys had been abolitionists before the war. Montgomery had actually fought alongside John Brown in Kansas. And so through these connections, she was finally able to put her unique skills in action. They were able to convince another old friend of hers, William Seward. William Seward was an old friend of Harriet Tubman's, who he was also an abolitionist from New York. And he served both as a senator in Congress for New York and as a governor for New York before becoming the Secretary of State under the Lincoln administration. And so while the Civil War was going on, he was the Secretary of State and also an old friend of Harriet Tubman's. And so here, let me find where I was before. Hold on. And so, because of all of these connections, she was finally able to get permission to put her skills in action. And so, what she did was she organized a comprehensive spy network. She became a spy for the Union Army.
That sounds like Harriet Tubman.
And this network was made up of former slaves from across the South. And so, what these people would do is they would disguise themselves as slaves, and they would go out into the South, into the Confederacy, and infiltrate different military installations in different areas across the South. They'd track troop movements, they'd track supply movements, and they'd also get in contact with people still enslaved on southern plantations in order to encourage them to sabotage Confederate assets, usually in the form of like work stoppages and stuff like that. They'd also encourage them whenever the Union troops would come through and liberate a plantation, they would be prepared to aid the Union troops as they passed through. So this spy ring ended up providing intel, which it ended up being instrumental in several large military operations, including the capture of Jacksonville, Florida. Like her spy ring was instrumental in capturing Jacksonville. On June 2nd, 1863, this is the wildest shit. This is up there with like stuff that she should be remembered for.
Yet it's not.
This I don't see this talked about a lot with her because it's not it doesn't involve the Underground Railroad. It involves like her spy work during the war. But this is just so it's really badass, honestly. Like it should be a bigger part of her story, but I don't see it talked about a lot with her when her name comes up. So on June 2nd, 1863, she personally led a raid on plantations along the Combahee River in South Carolina. Like, personally led them. She was commanding 150 black troops of the 2nd South Carolina Volunteer Regiment and led them on a raid to loot all of these plantations. They struck out by boat up the river in the middle of the night. They landed on the shore and they started raiding these plantations. They burned everything. They burned the crops, they burned the buildings, they burned the houses. They loaded up 756, exactly the exact number, 756 enslaved people onto these boats. And they were gone by the time that Confederate forces could respond. When Confederate soldiers walked up, all they found were burning buildings, burning crops, and not a single slave in sight.
Dang.
It was an overwhelming success, and Harriet Tubman, through this, became the very first black woman to ever lead American troops in the history of the U.S. Army. Why doesn't that get brought up more with her story?
Because they barely want to tell her story.
Oh man, that's why 756 people. Those people, just the people in this one raid that were saved from slavery in this one raid, their descendants probably number in the thousands by this point. There are thousands of people who live without who don't live in slavery now today because of this woman. In just this one raid. That is amazing. For the rest of the war, she continued her work in South Carolina. She giving nursing and she cooked food and she gave nursing aid to wounded soldiers and refugees. She took a brief trip back home to New York to convalesce from an illness, another illness probably related to her head injury. During that trip back, it was like 1864, she met Sojourner Truth. Have you heard of Sojourner Truth before?
I think I've heard the name Sojourner, but that's it.
Sojourner Truth was another famous escaped slave. She had been in the late 1700s. She had been um, her her family came from slaves that had been owned by Dutch settlers in Long Island. And so she was it's really weird. She was a native Dutch speaker because her family had originally been owned by uh, Dutch settlers. But by the time that she was born, her family was owned by an English speaking family. And so even though she grew up speaking Dutch, um, her her masters growing up treated her whole family like shit because none of them could speak English. Is really a really interesting story. It's really fascinating, but she has some really horrific stories about her enslavement, and she became one of like the earliest, most famous escaped slaves in American history. She escaped in like the early 1830s. Ended up settling originally in New York. She eventually ended up in Michigan. And she was a huge abolitionist figure. She was like she was up there with Frederick Douglass with like how famous she was with on the circuit giving speeches about the horrors of slavery and how important the abolitionist cause was, that kind of stuff. So another one of those famous abolitionists at the time. She met Sojourner Truth. So Harriet met Sojourner Truth during this in 1864 during the war. And during this time, Truth was giving speeches and rallying support for Lincoln's administration in order to raise donations for different relief societies that were providing aid to like refugees from the war. And while we're on the topic, I thought I'd admit it, or I thought I'd mention it. That Harriet Tubman and Sojourner Truth actually had a little bit of a disagreement because Sojourner Truth was a huge supporter of Lincoln, like Lincoln's number one fan. Harriet was she wasn't as on board with Lincoln. She didn't like Lincoln very much. So during this time when black troops were starting to become a bigger and bigger thing within the Union Army, it became pretty obvious that the white officers in the Union Army were not treating black troops very well. They were getting paid less than their white counterparts. They were undersupplied chronically. They faced much stricter disciplinary stuff whenever like military discipline. Like it was a lot like they got court-martialed a lot more. They were subject to more strict punishments, stuff like that. And Harriet was seeing all of this, and she was very well aware of it. And she kind of blamed Lincoln for it. She thought that he wasn't doing enough to kind of stop this discrimination that a lot of these black troops were suffering.
It's pretty important, yeah.
Yeah, I thought I'd mention that because kind of get a sense of where she kind of is during this conflict. She ended up returning to duty from her illness in the spring of 1865, sometime around early March. This was just after the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which was supposed to abolish slavery in the entire United States. Kinda. That's the way that it's presented. The 13th Amendment was supposed to have completely abolished the institution of slavery. And it did in the form that slavery was taking at the time, which was the private ownership of human beings by other human beings. What it ended up doing, though, because of the specific language used in the 13th Amendment, was there's this big loophole where it says no person shall be held held in slavery or whatever, except for punishment for a crime.
This was the slate. This was the prison thing you were talking about.
Yeah, this is that little bit that screws the whole thing up for everybody. Because now what we've got are privately owned for-profit prisons, which are taking uh, government subsidies in order to uh, take in prisoners who have been arrested and convicted by the state. And officially, they are wards of the state. And while they are in prison, it is legal to not pay them or to pay them significantly under the minimum wage for labor that they are forced to do. And so, what has happened because of this is the moneyed interests that own these private prisons have successfully lobbied alongside a bunch of other interest groups and lobbying groups to increase the penalties for certain crimes and to funnel prisoners into these sorts of labor punishments for their sentences through these private prisons, which makes these prisons a lot of money producing goods with cheap labor. And the root of all of this are laws which disproportionately target.
Honestly, there's still a lot of laws that disproportionately target Black Americans, even if unintentionally.
Yeah, especially drug laws. The drug war is it. People always scoff at this when I say this, but the drug war is,
The war on drugs was specifically racist. Yeah.
yeah, it was specifically to target black people. The federal government flooded black communities with crack cocaine, got a bunch of people hooked on crack cocaine, and then penalized them for it so that they could be funneled into private for profit prisons, exploiting a loophole in the 13th Amendment to return them into slaves. So that's what I'm talking about when I say that the 13th Amendment kind of abolished slavery, but not really. Anyways, back to Harriet Tubman. So she returned to duty in the spring of 1865, and she ended up serving in a couple different hospital camps, but this was really close to the end of the war. So she got back in like early March. And like a month later, on April 9th, 1865, the Confederate General in Chief, Robert E. Lee, surrendered to the Union General Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, which effectively ended the war and reunited the country. And then, of course, 5 days later, Abraham Lincoln was shot in the back of the head by a Confederate sympathizer while he was attending a play at Ford Theater in Washington, D.C., and he ended up dying the next day. So that's the end of the Civil War. So slavery's been abolished, mostly. It's going to come back. But for all intents and purposes, for the moment, slavery is abolished. The power of the planter class of the southern states has been broken. Their back is broken. And now the federal government has carte blanche to reshape American society into a new, more fair place to live, especially for the now free black population of the South. So now the war's over. In the aftermath, Harriet decided that, you know, her mission is done. She's done. That's it.
I can't really blame her at this point. She's done more than her fair share.
Yeah, there's no slavery anymore. She is now free. Her family's free. All of her friends are free. Her two siblings that she never saw again, that were sold off when she was young, if they're still alive, they're now free. She's good. Her job's done. She deserves some rest. She deserves to go ahead and settle down to
Call it
like
a
a
day.
nice, quiet, easy life. The first thing that she did was after she was She was done with her job. She got on a train in Virginia that was heading north to her home, her new home in Auburn, New York. The train conductor thought that she had stolen or forged her transport pass because she was using a military transport pass because she was a member of the United States military. Officially, she was a nurse, but she was also acting as a spy and had commanded Union regular troops in a military operation.
Damn.
So, for all intents and purposes, she was a soldier in the U.S. Army. She had a military transport pass, which entitled her to sit her happy little ass down into a seat in a passenger car on a train that will take her home. The conductor decided that a black woman could not have one of these passes, that she had either stolen it or forged it, demanded that she leave her seat in the passenger car. She refused, and it took 4 men to drag her from her seat and throw her into the storage car for the rest of the trip. It took 4 men. I need to remind you, this woman is 5 foot tall.
She was only 5 foot?
She was only 5 foot.
Damn.
It took 4 men to drag her from that seat. Also, in the process, they probably beat her too because she ended up having to recover from the injuries on the train
No doubt.
for several months after. That didn't set a good tone for the state of black people in post Civil War America, in her mind.
I can't really blame her.
Yeah, it's understandable. That 100% fair. But she was really done. She got back to Auburn, New York. She settled down into a quiet life with her family. She did stay politically active, not nearly as radical as what she was doing before the war or during the war, but she was still politically active. She became a prominent speaker in the women's suffrage movement. She turned her house into a charity home for the poor. Spent a lot of time taking care of the needy, especially elderly and disabled black New Yorkers, because at the time, no old folks home would take in black people, and so outside there was one in New York City, and her house became the only other one in the entire state. Unfortunately, in the last few decades of her life, she also spent a lot of time having to twist ears in Washington, D.C. in order to get compensation and benefits for her military service during the war.
I'm kind of surprised she did because I wouldn't. That kind of sounds like the kind of thing they would just ignore.
Yet they did ignore it for a very long time. She was also fighting to get compensation for other black soldiers and other women who had also served the Union cause, because black soldiers and women who had served in the Union Army were almost completely abandoned after the war, did not get any of what they were owed. But especially her own compensation was especially frustrating because it was not hard to prove her service to the Union cause during the war, because she literally had documentation in the form of letters written by Secretary of State William Seward himself.
Damn.
Who, like I said earlier, was one of her closest friends. And he was also the man, the house she was living in Auburn, New York at this point. He actually gave that house to her.
Dang.
Where her and her family were living.
Dang.
And so these letters from the Secretary of State literally showed that her actions during the war were under the jurisdiction of the federal government, which legally entitled her to benefits for federal service. I want you to guess how long it took for her to finally receive her compensation after the war.
12 years.
Way more. 30 years. It took 30 years.
Wow.
She did eventually get it. It was the mid or late 1890s when she finally got her military compensation. But in 1869, just 4 years after the war ended, Harriet actually ended up remarrying. She found another guy.
Finally, after her husband betrayed her.
I don't know if it was more. I think it was more complicated than that, but I don't.
I don't know. I don't. It doesn't feel more complicated, but that's because we have the historical accuracy to go on.
Whatever the case, she remarried to this man named Nelson Davis. Nelson Davis, the two of them had met during the war when Davis was serving in a black regiment, the 8th New York Volunteers. After the war, he had moved in with her in Auburn, and they ended up marrying in 1869. They married in a Presbyterian church on March 18th. Here's now, this is going to sound weird, but from the context, I don't think it's as weird as it sounds. He was 20 years younger than her.
Younger, dang.
Yeah, he was younger. Yeah. Yeah, because during the war, she was closing in. She was in her late 30s when the war began. He was like 19 when he enlisted.
That's crazy.
They really loved each other. Like they stayed. They apparently, by all accounts, it was a very happy marriage. They really genuinely loved each other. They were together for 19 years until he passed away in 1888. After he passed, she applied for a veteran's widow pension. So in in 18, I think it was actually 1890, they passed a bill. Congress passed a bill that the widows of Civil War veterans would be entitled to compensation after their husbands died.
Did that go both ways for widowers in Harriet's case?
Well, Harriet was a widow of a Civil War veteran because he was a veteran too. They were both veterans, but and so she.
Yeah, but like, does that mean he could double collect though?
I don't know because he died before her, so I don't know how that would have worked. So yeah, after he passed, she applied for a veteran's widow pension, but part of getting the benefits from this pension was that you had to prove that your husband served. But when he was serving, his name was not Nelson Davis. His name was Nelson Charles. He changed his name after the war. And so they gave her grief about that because they claimed that she couldn't prove that it was the same man. And they also said that she probably wouldn't be able to prove it was the same man because she wouldn't be able to have access to his birth certificate. The reason she didn't have access to his birth certificate was because he was born into slavery. He didn't have a birth certificate. And so it took another 4 years of that back and forth for her to finally receive those benefits. In 1903, when she was in her mid 80s, so we're into the 20th century now. She was in her mid 80s. She donated a parcel of land and a home next door to hers to a local black church, and that home and that plot of land got turned into like a fully functional, fully staffed old folks home for black elders.
Awesome.
Uh, she was the guest of honor at its opening. The facility was named in her honor. It was called the Harriet Tubman House. But in accordance with her own wishes, the main building, the where the facilities would be, was called the John Brown Hall. Late in her life, she ended up becoming through her work in the suffrage movement. She ended up becoming good friends with Susan B. Anthony, and even in her old age, she was in her like early mid 80s at this point. She was still like giving speeches and taking trips and stuff.
She lived super long, even for today.
She lived super long. She ended up being forced to kind of take it a little easier after she got sick in 1911. And after she recovered from the sickness, she decided it's probably time for me to move into an old folks' home so I can be taken care of. And so she moved next door into the John Brown Hall at the Harriet Tubman house to be taken care of. Worked out great for her. That was a good investment on her part. And then March 1913, she ended up falling sick again. And she knew this, this is it. She told her friends to start preparing for her death. On the evening of March 10th, 1913, surrounded by all of her closest friends, her nieces, her nephews, and her grandchildren, because she did end up having, I think she had a couple biological kids with Nelson Davis, but I know for a fact she did have one adopted daughter, and she did have grandkids. But surrounded by all of her loved ones in the world, she raised her head from her pillow one last time and she told all of them, quote, "I go to prepare a place for you." And then she laid down her head and she closed her eyes for the last time. Later that week, she was buried at Fort Hill Cemetery in Auburn, New York, with full military honors. Since her death, Harriet Tubman has served as obviously a potent symbol of freedom for Black Americans, especially during the civil rights movement. Her image continues to cause outrage amongst racists to this day.
No shit.
No shit. In several southern states, artistic portrayals of Tubman holding a musket have been blocked by both by protests and by state legislatures under the excuse that the portrayal of a black woman holding a gun would be inflammatory.
Well, they're just a pieces of shit.
Yeah, they're pieces of shit. What they're basically saying is if you suggest that a black woman might be able to have a weapon, it would cause all of the black people to start to destroy everything. That's basically what they were saying.
Hey, it's exactly what they were saying.
Famously, Harriet Tubman became the target of conservative culture warriors in 1994 when the wife of, at the time, she was the former head of the National Endowment of the Humanities. She would later go on to become the wife of a vice president. Her name was Lynn Cheney, wife of Dick Cheney. She accused the National Center of History and the schools at UCLA of historical revisionism, accusing their new curriculum guidelines of abandoning major American figures like George Washington in favor of quote unquote obscure minority figures like Harriet Tubman. Basically saying, like, why are you talking about black people? Why aren't you talking about George Washington more?
Why aren't you talking about the good white people?
Yeah, if you talk about black people, it makes America look bad because America's always been very bad to black people. More recently, like within recent memory, the administration of President Joe Biden announced that Harriet Tubman would be replacing Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill.
Which should have happened.
Now, this has caused a good deal of backlash from all sides of American politics. On the right, the idea of honoring a black woman who freed over 1,000 enslaved people over a racist white slave owner is an unconscionable example of political correctness run amok.
Well, and he wasn't just a racist white slave owner. He was a piece of shit who should have been impeached.
He was also he was also a
A
genocidal
genocidal
maniac
maniac.
and also committed
Jinx.
crimes by like the letter of the law and should have been like the first president impeached, but that another discussion for another time. On the left, people argue that honoring an icon of black civil rights in this way is a disrespectful token gesture by a government that continues to ignore or actively enforces issues plaguing black Americans. which is kind of more my position on it. Also, like the idea of putting a black woman who escaped from slavery onto a $20 bill to be like traded back and forth in business transactions um doesn't it kind of raises an eyebrow with me a little bit. So, but underneath all of this controversy surrounding her legacy, which unnecessary controversy, Tubman's life and deeds continued to serve as a symbol of resistance and defiance in the face of oppression for millions of black Americans. Today there are thousands of descendants of the people led to the promised land by Tubman. Thousands who owe their lives and their liberty to her actions. And even a quarter of the way through the 21st century, her example still inspires and will continue to inspire the ongoing fight for freedom and for justice for years to come. And that's it. That's what I got about Harriet Tubman. Yeah, what are your thoughts? What are you thinking?
Harriet Tubman should be a bigger focus in history than, oh, she led the Underground Railroad.
This woman is tougher
Than so many historical figures, it's not even funny.
right. Like she was a superhero. Like the type for all intents and purposes, she was a superhero, like a real life superhero. It is insane. It is phenomenal that a woman like this existed.
Any final thoughts before we head out, Derek?
None from me, just
So, where can they find you on social media, Derek?
they could find me on Twitter at Visigoth. The first I is a 1, the O is a 0. Tim, tell them all the stuff I don't bother to remember.
So they can find me on Twitter at Tim, aka Otis, and they can also find the podcast on Twitter at Alex Society Pod and Facebook and Instagram at the Alexander Society Pod. And if they have enjoyed this podcast that they have listened to today, please give us a rate and review on your podcast streaming service of choice. And we would like you to have a great day, and we will see you next time.
Bye.